And we are back on the Zero Hour. Joining us now is good friend of the program, Pando Daily roving reporter Yasha Levine. And Yasha, you've really been rolling and roving lately. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Listen, we were worried about you. We've been reading your dispatches from Ukraine and from the Luhansk People's Republic and some of the other rebel-held areas, and glad to see you back and safe and sound.
Thanks. Yeah, it's nice to be back in boring Santa Monica.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine where the biggest danger is a traffic tie-up on the 405. Glad to have you back, but I wanted to talk to you about the great reporting you did there. First of all, I wanted to start out by just kind of going over with you for people who don't know, it's striking to me how little people in this country know actually about the conflict in the Ukraine. I mean, they basically get the idea that, well, we don't like Putin and he's doing something aggressive and maybe everybody's bad there, but they don't really get what's going on. So just a quick review. You've got a couple breakaway republics, Russian support for them. You've got Ukraine military conducting actions against them, and I gather you have everybody else in the middle trying to survive, and that's what you went in. You went into rebel-held Ukraine, but first of all, if I've summarized it inaccurately or in a distorted way, let me know. But secondly, tell us about how you got in there.
Yeah, well, no, you got it right. I mean, it's a very complicated. It's a very complicated conflict. It's to really understand it. You have to really dive deep into the history of the region, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And a lot of people in America, who are sort of critical of American foreign policy, as they should be. We here tend to see things in terms of our own politics, of our own domestic situation. So everyone's blaming it on America, right? And or let's say, oh, it's America's meddling, and then they say that Russia is like the innocent party here, and then there's the other side. But the conflict is not like either Russia's bad or America's bad because it's trying to create these revolutions everywhere around the world and create regime change and destabilizing countries all around the world. It's somewhere. It's like it's both Russia's bad and America's bad. It's kind of like there's no good guy here.
Exactly, and I want to talk about that for a second because I think that's exactly what's wrong with our thinking about it. Is we're thinking, well, who are the good guys so we can go in and give them air cover or whatever. But the point is,
I'll tell you who we think the good guys are at this point. Neo-Nazis. In Ukraine, yeah, that's what America's good guys are at this point. Neo-Nazis in Ukraine, straight up fascists.
You're not saying they are the good guys. You're saying because I know you better than that. So what are you really saying? You're saying that. Go ahead.
Well, what I'm saying is that a lot of the groups that are kind of the avant-garde of this sort of a pro-European revolution that happened in Ukraine. The avant-garde, the people who are really on the front lines and really pushing it and were willing to die for this revolution. They are a minority in Ukraine, but they are pretty powerful in terms of their effect on the political situation, and they are straight up neo-Nazi groups. A lot of them, ultra-nationalist Ukrainians, who want to sort of recreate a kind of a pure Ukrainian, ethnically pure Ukrainian state. And a lot of these guys actually are, go back to the groups that were collaborating with Nazi Germany, during World War II, in that war, and actually were responsible for horrific war crimes, mass murders of Jews in Ukraine and also of Poles, because Ukrainians and the Polish people have been sort of at each other's throat as well. And yeah.
So you get into the thing where people in this country think the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and we know something about Putin which we don't like him, so therefore these people must be the good guys. But you're saying there were, I saw this to a certain extent when I was doing work in Eastern Europe in the late 80s and early 90s, where people were saying, for example, the Hungarian uprising, that they must be great guys, but there were already kind of ultra nationalistic factions in there. This sounds even more extreme, and they were actually setting up. So you've got these people, and they're then where do these breakaway people's republics, Luhansk and Donetsk and so on, where do they fit into all of this?
Yeah, well, it's good. They fit in on kind of the opposite spectrum of like the ultra nationalist fight, and so they fit in. So the Luhansk and Donetsk regions are they're in the east of Ukraine, in the very east of Ukraine. It's a very poor region. It was an industrial region with mines and a lot of heavy industry. And because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, everything was deindustrialized, right? And so they were kind of plunged into poverty, and they really haven't gotten out of that. And anyway, all the businesses that are there now are owned by just a couple of guys, a couple of Ukrainian oligarchs. And so it's a very poor region, predominantly leaning to the they lean towards Russia, and because it's natural, because before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was really no border between Russia and Ukraine. There was a border, but you just walk across it, and there's a lot of intermarriage. People, it's just everyone has Ukrainians and Russians in their families, so it's a totally integrated culture. But leaning towards Russia, everyone speaks Russian. Many people might not even speak Ukrainian. And so when the revolution happened when former president now Viktor Yanukovych was ousted on February 22nd of this year, and a kind of new interim government came to power, they were really ultra nationalist Ukrainians, and so they started demonizing and the Russian culture and Russian language for sort of being the oppressor, the language and culture of the oppressor, which is Russia, and so the people in the East, felt antagonized and scared, and so there was a lot of worry there, and so they started sort of creating their own little revolution in turn there, and taking over some government administration buildings and things like that. It was fairly peaceful. Maybe they had people who were armed a little bit. It was mostly localized with a bit of sort of Russian-backed kind of separatist types that were beginning to flow into the region. And this is this is right after Russia seized Crimea, sort of like half island almost, sort of on the southeast of Ukraine, and so a very strategic place where Russia has a naval base. And so there was a sort of mixture of local sort of separatist feeling mixed in with support and people that were kind of sort of flowing in from Russia to bolster and to fortify this separatist activity. And a lot of the people who were flowing into these breakaway regions, they were also kind of, but they were nationalists, but Russian nationalists and Russian ultra nationalists. Right. And a lot of them were, pro-monarchy, monarchists, even like, Russian Orthodox monarchists. There's like weird stuff going on there. But there was a lot of people. So there was a lot of actually kind of a, radical left-wing types who were also, saw this as a kind of a fight between a sort of the glory of the, maybe a faded glory of the Soviet Union and a kind of a more egalitarian system and a kind of neoliberal Western imperialism, right? And so they joined into the fight as well. So the breakaway regions became this really a hodgepodge of locals and of Russian nationalists, Russian leftists. It's always it's like a Russian, straight up like Russian special forces. Also,
okay, so I get the picture, and it's crazy. And what I think we'll do is we'll take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about. So this is the insane situation that you found yourself moving into a few weeks ago, and I want to talk about that when we come back. With the break, we're talking with Yasha Levine, roving reporter for Pando Daily, about his time in the breakaway republics of Ukraine. We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour talking with Yasha Levine, roving reporter for Pando Daily, who's just come back from some time in the breakaway republics of Ukraine. So, Yasha, so you spent some time on the border. You were hanging out with the refugees and hearing the terrible stories of what they've gone through. And I'm talking about refugees from these breakaway republics moving over into Russia. Then you move in with a Russian convoy. You cross the border into the breakaway, one of the breakaway republics, Luhansk, I think it was first. And so what did you see there? I mean, basically, you talk about a lot of uncertainty, instability, misery, chaos. Is that basically it? Nobody knows what's going on, and it's just changing from day to day, and people are suffering in the meantime. What's the deal over there?
Yeah, well, look, when I went there in August, at that point, sort of there's been fierce fighting for about 4 months in eastern Ukraine. So, centered around two of the bigger cities there, called Luhansk and Donetsk. And those cities have been, shelled by artillery, mortar fire, aerial bombardment. Some of the stuff has been like these unguided rockets that are really damaging. They're used against sort of ground forces. They just, imagine just like a Pez dispenser on a truck filled with missiles, and they just go and they just fire off, and they just blanket an area. Indiscriminately bombing, killing and destroying everything in sight. So, these are, fairly dense residential areas with residential buildings, houses, hospitals, schools, and there was almost no warning given by the Ukrainian military when it started its so-called, they call it an terrorist operation. That's what they call it. They call the war or the conflict in eastern Ukraine an anti-terrorist operation. Which basically says that anyone who is sort of defending their own city from an attack is a terrorist. The situation was grim. A lot of these cities had no power, no water. They were almost completely empty at this point. There were over 1 million refugees. Hundreds of thousands coming into Russia, and many of them were not even, expecting to ever come back because they had lost everything. Their apartments, their car, anything of value. And so it really kind of, they didn't want to remain in a country that would, bomb them, basically bomb its own citizens like that.
Right.
And so there were hundreds of thousands streaming into Russia. Just across the border, there was a little refugee camp that was sort of processing people. But hundreds of thousands were also going, the other way into Ukraine and staying with family, friends, and in different cities all across the country. And the refugee situation in Ukraine itself was really bad because the government is essentially kind of a failed state at this point. It has no money; it's completely bankrupt. It can't even sustain its own military, really.
So you have these people leaving Ukraine, refugees because of the fighting. You have people going in, presumably to fight. You have 1 million refugees. And it sounds like what happened was that in these breakaway republics was that by being aggressive and attacking so indiscriminately, the Ukrainian military created a situation where you couldn't be neutral if you lived in one of those places, but because by the act of defending your home, you became an enemy of the Ukrainian state, and you either had to leave or fight. And is that a fair summary too?
That is a fair summary, and I met actually, several people who were refugees or knew refugees. Their families were refugees from there, and they said that when this conflict first began, they were completely neutral. Actually, they didn't care. They just wanted to live their life in peace, and they didn't, want to join Russia. They didn't want to break away. They didn't want more autonomy or kind of more of a federalized structure that gave them more local autonomy to their government. They didn't care that much. I mean, they were worried about of course, the events of the political upheaval that was happening in Kiev, but they didn't really care, or they didn't have a side. But but then their house and their whole entire street was destroyed by aerial bombardment by the Ukrainian military, and so they naturally took a side, and they took a side against their own country because it was their own government that was in place. So yeah, it's really a serious problem, and sort of the ethnic tensions that were kind of always below the surface in Ukraine
Right.
Are really kind of coming to the fore right now, and are being excited, and so the Ukrainian nationalism that's in the general population in Ukraine is really kind of running at a fever pitch at this point.
Which is
it's very scary. Very scary.
Yeah, that's how atrocities, widespread atrocities happen. And I guess, look, in trying to look forward on this, I mean, I can't personally imagine that there's going to be an independent nation of Luhansk or Donetsk. I mean, I can't imagine these are viable nation states. So, do you have any idea how this thing is likely to play out and resolve itself?
Well, yeah. I think it's going to be an unresolved conflict for a long time, maybe for forever. As far as here's the sad situation, is that this war or this conflict is good for everybody involved, and everybody involved. I mean, it's good for the Russian government. It's good for President Putin. It's good for the Ukrainian politicians who have seized power. And it's good for American neocons and the military-industrial complex.
Right.
So, because it's good for America for obvious reasons, because it keeps the military industry going, and it keeps the conflict alive, and that's what they do. And in Ukraine, it allows these politicians to get sort of Western backing and support, because they're the bulwark against this Russian menace to the east, and so they can retain power. It's good for some of the oligarchs there that are really running the show for real, because they get to seize the assets and fight amongst each other and sort of consolidate power, because some of the oligarchs are on the outs because they were sort of pro-Russian, and so there's actually kind of an oligarchical war or looting that's happening also.
Right. I'm sure they're taking everything. I'm sure they're taking everything they can while they can. So basically what you're saying is that we got a situation that's in the interest of everybody, by the way, including the military commentators who go on Meet the Press. It's in the interest of everybody except the people getting killed and losing their homes. And they have nothing to say.
Yeah, no, and no one ever cares about them really, and so and in Russia, the situation really has played into Putin's hands. I mean, massively, because he has declining support, political support among just the population ever since his third term, and this has really kind of bolstered a reawakened nationalism and a pride in Russia, and his approval rating is like over 90%, I think, or almost 90%.
Nothing, man. There's nothing like a war to get a politician's ratings back up.
And in some ways, I was born in the Soviet Union. My wife is Russian, and I completely understand this sort of this outpouring of sort of, I guess, latent pride that's been beaten out of the Russians for ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's like they've been sort of pushed around. They feel like they've been told what to do. They aren't allowed to sort of express their own independent view of the world, or have their own traditional spheres of influence, or even have a say in what goes on inside Russia, let alone outside of it. And so they see as this kind of for the final straw, in this relationship that they've kind of been abused all the time,
So it becomes a matter of national pride. They want to pursue it. It's good for Putin, so he doesn't want to resolve it. It's good for the Ukrainian central government. So, man, it's a grim situation. But I'm glad you went there. I'm glad you got back alive, and I'm glad you came on our show. We really appreciate it. Thanks, man.
Thank you. No, thanks for having me. It was good to talk.
You bet. We've been talking with Yasha Levine about Ukraine. He's roving reporter for Pando Daily. And that's it for our program. I'm Richard, RJ Eskow. Please tune in again next week. Remember, this is the Zero Hour.